Okay, welcome back everyone. It is 7/21 of 2015. We're going to look at the remainder of the introductory comments by Brentano on the continuum. And we've already looked at the three moments. The only new material is in the second moment, the realm of spirit. So we're just going to review the realm of spirit for a second time. And the new material will be the additional comments on his concept of Proter-Aisthesis, which in this volume he really clearly defines. So his earlier lectures were very limited on their description of this concept. And so this time, because it does apply so directly to the continuum, he gives us a very detailed analysis of Proter-Aisthesis. So we will review the second moment, the realm of spirit, the psychical realm of the presentation of the secondary object, and that confrontation of the secondary object by the individual, perceiving individual with his or her existential and analytic experience. So we begin by mentioning that the continuum is a perception phenomena. It is a secondary object, not a primary object, but it is derived from the sensate, but it is a secondary object. The memory will store the sensible impressions of the continuous in the mechanical memory and give us that content out of which we can form our model of a teleosis. In this volume, Brentano gives us a three-step methodology. First, we existentially grasp the intuitive sensate parts that coincide within a generalized whole. And then we form a generalized abstraction to define that enclosure, that boundary for all of the coinciding parts. And then we raise those parts to the level of signification and form a true eschatological trajectory of a continuum of the interrelatedness of all the signs. He calls this model a reism of plerothrsis, and plerothrsis is the filling of the boundary in its complete dimensional state of all five dimensions. It is a reism, it's a category of things, but things are signs of the concrete. So it's a sign model which represents the concrete existence, and it is shaped within a boundary that gives it a cohesive whole. And then we want to raise that to signification and develop an eschatological trajectory for the entire sign model. He calls this a reism of plerothrsis, and it is tension between a fundamentum and a terminus, and the fundamentum is our posited ideality, and the terminus is the moment of praxis and actuality, that dialectic of actually working out the ideality of our model. So it's always an aim toward the non-existence of the model and trying to bring it into fruition, trying to bring it into actuality, and also to seek a return from those who receive it of recognition that it is a positing of the universal, that it applies universally. So it is a seeking of universality even though we are positing a probability. Now, the additional material that we get in this particular portion is the explanation of the concept of Proter-Aisthesis, and it's the modality of the way that we view the five-dimensional sensate presentation. Because for Brentano, we view the sensate presentation in two different ways. We view it head-on, but we also view it at an angle, which is a spiritual angle. So it's a spiritually angled perception, basically defines the concept of Proter-Aisthesis. But aisthesis, the Greek concept of aisthesis, is feeling-type perception as opposed to logismos. And logimos is a reasoning-type perception, or logic. So aisthesis, or our aesthetics, is feeling perception as opposed to logic, or logismos. And proter means former existence, so Proter-Aisthesis for Brentano is a aesthetic or a feeling type perception of the temporal continuum, from the former to the current to the future. So it's a aesthetic feeling type perceiving of our sensate reality and grasping that sensate reality, each thing, within its own continuum that accompanies it, its own past, present, and future. So it's a feeling perception of a former modality of an object, and it's really all three modalities of the object, the past, present, and future. It's called oblique apprehension because it is indirect, it's angled. And he says this is opposed to the Latin recto, which means directly facing. So it's not the face-on perception where we intuitively grasp the thing. It's the indirect or angled perception where we grasp the temporal modality. So face-on, you grasp the intuitive thing, but at the spiritually angled perception, you grasp its continuum. It's a temporal continuum from past, present to future. So it is spiritually angled or spiritually slanted view of the sensate presentation. Now, what is being apprehended through this oblique apprehension? Glimpses of the continuum, the before, the after, and the continuum. And it creates also the temporal extension of consciousness as a secondary object because it is internalized within the self, the perceiving self. But we are grasping glimpses because every singular object within the enclosed boundary has a temporal modality of its own. So we grasp the temporal modality of each individual thing, and we grasp the temporal modality of the entire enclosure because everything is enjoined in a co-temporality. So there is a co-temporal existence within which every part participates, but each part also possesses its own accompanying temporal modality. So we will grasp the glimpses of the continuum in the individual parts, and through analytical analysis, we will eventually arrive at the overall co-temporality that depicts the entire enclosure, and that will give us the trajectory of our model. So continuum has individuality and it has co-temporality. The parts are individual parts, but they are also coexisting parts that exist as categorical primary categories and concepts and signs that form subsystems. So you have an entire model of the larger category with its subsystems that are abbreviated under it, and everything has its own individual temporality, its individual temporal modality, its own temporal continuum, but all of it is interrelated. Every sign is interrelated to another sign, and many signs are abbreviated under a category, and then categories are interrelated to each other to make up a holistic model, all enclosed within a boundary, but that boundary has a trajectory. Now, once we grasp the glimpses of the continuum of the individual parts, then we move toward analytically grasping the trajectory of the temporal continuum of the entire interrelated sign model. And that's what Proter-Aisthesis actually is. It's this work of really getting the glimpses of continuum and then the overall trajectory of the boundary. So it's a much better definition, a much better explanation of Proter-Aisthesis by Brentano toward the latter portion of his career. He really gives us a clear depiction here. But now we understand that Proter-Aisthesis specifically addresses continuum. And that's why it really wasn't brought to light prior to this, because he didn't really get into this work on continuum until the latter portion of his career. But Proter-Aisthesis addresses continuum, the individual parts, the individual signs, and the glimpse of continuum we get there. But then their co-temporality and their interrelatedness, which starts to come together and build and build and build until eventually we gain a picture of an overall trajectory of the generalized boundary in order to lift it to eschatological trajectory that makes the boundary raised to the sign level. Once boundary is raised to eschatological trajectory, it becomes signification. And we get that picture of the overall inclusive temporal modality through Proter-Aisthesis. It's all angled viewing of the sensate reality. It's not head-on. It's for those that can view reality spiritually, those who can see spirit. Well, those who see spirit look at reality in a very specific, particular, learned way. It's a way that an individual has learned how to see reality. We learn how to see spiritually. We learn how to apprehend the spiritual and individual components of our experience. And we learn how to see the spiritual in an event. We can take an event, whatever that event might be. It might be an event of suffering. It might be an event of celebration. Whatever the case may be, we can take an event and we can see it at a sensate level, and we can see it at a spiritual level if we've been educated to the point of being able to apprehend spiritually. But when we do that, we have a very specific, angled way of looking at reality to get that spiritual glimpse. And that's what Brentano is addressing here. He's addressing the Proter-Aisthesis, the aesthetic, feeling type apprehension of the spiritual. And that's why it falls into this second moment of the realm of spirit, and it becomes the way, or it becomes the methodology of the way that we form a Proter-Aesthetic reism of pleurosis. We form that model, that sign model, through a methodology of this angled spiritual aesthetic apprehension of the spiritual truth, the spiritual modality of a continuum. So it's a great, better depiction and analysis of his concept of Proter-Aisthesis, which earlier in his career he gave us just very little data on this. So it's a much more developed view, a much more detailed view, and it'll help us to really shape our mind as we work through the remainder of the volume. We're just really into introductory material here, but now we have a framework and a better understanding of his realm of spirit. It'll help us to grasp the individual lectures. So that'll wrap up our introductory material. It ended up being a 24-page introduction, so it was a pretty decent introduction, but he closed it out with a real detailed description of Proter-Aisthesis, and so we can be thankful for that, and we will continue on to the meat of the individual lectures after this.